When a desperate pregnant girl knocked on Thomas McKenna's door during a Montana storm in 1885, he expected to turn her away, but something in her terrified eyes made him offer shelter instead. As their unlikely bond deepened into family, a dangerous man from her past arrived with legal papers and deadly intentions, forcing them to fight for the love they'd built from nothing. But when the community rallied around them and the truth about real fatherhood emerged, would their chosen family prove stronger than blood and money, or would one man's greed destroy the home they'd sacrificed everything to create? The coffee pot crashed to the floor, shattering into a dozen pieces across Thomas McKenna's kitchen. He stared at the mess, his hands shaking like autumn leaves in the wind. 3 months had passed since he'd buried his wife Sarah, and he still couldn't make it through morning coffee without breaking something that reminded him she was gone forever. Outside his Montana ranch, October wind howled through the valley like a wild animal searching for shelter. The sound made his chest feel tight and empty at the same time. Thomas swept up the broken pieces, each clink of pottery against the dustpan echoing in the silence that had become his constant companion. His neighbor Jake had stopped by yesterday with another suggestion. "You need help around here, Tom. This place is falling apart without Sarah's touch." Jake wasn't wrong. Dust covered every surface, dirty clothes piled up in corners, and Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a proper meal instead of cold beans straight from the can. The newspaper lay folded on his kitchen table, still showing the advertisement he'd been staring at for 3 days. Wanted. Reliable woman for ranch housework. Good pay for honest work. Contact Thomas McKenna, Bitter Creek Ranch. The words seemed to mock him now. What kind of woman would want to work for a man who couldn't even make coffee without destroying his kitchen? Thunder rumbled overhead as storm clouds gathered like dark blankets across the sky. Thomas walked to his front window and watched lightning dance between the mountains. The weather matched his mood perfectly: dark, angry, and unpredictable. He'd built this ranch with Sarah, planning to fill it with children and laughter. Now it felt like a tomb made of wood and stone. His cattle needed tending, fences required mending, and winter was coming whether he was ready or not. The work never stopped, even when your heart felt like it had been ripped from your chest. Thomas pulled on his heavy coat and headed for the barn, knowing that physical labor was the only thing that quieted his racing thoughts. The barn smelled of hay and leather, familiar scents that usually brought comfort. Tonight, they only reminded him of evening chores he used to share with Sarah. She would milk the cows while he fed the horses, both of them talking about their plans for tomorrow. Now tomorrow stretched ahead like an endless empty road. Rain began pelting the barn roof in steady rhythm. Thomas forked hay into the horse stalls, his muscles moving automatically while his mind wandered to memories he couldn't escape. Sarah's laugh when she'd accidentally startled the chickens. Her gentle hands bandaging his cuts after wrestling with barbed wire. The way she hummed while kneading bread, filling their home with warmth and music. A sharp crack of thunder made the horses whicker nervously in their stalls. Thomas patted his old gelding's neck, whispering reassurances he didn't feel himself. "Easy, Buck. Just a storm passing through." But this storm felt different somehow, charged with electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up straight. Back in the house, Thomas lit the oil lamp and sat at his kitchen table with paper and pen. Maybe Jake was right about needing help. Maybe having another person around would make the silence less crushing. He started writing a new advertisement, choosing each word carefully like he was building a fence. Each piece had to be strong enough to hold up under pressure. Seeking capable woman for household duties at working ranch. Must be hardy, reliable, and comfortable with country living. Fair wages and respectable employment offered to the right person. He read the words 3 times, wondering if they sounded too desperate or not desperate enough. The lamp flame flickered in a draft from somewhere, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas folded the paper and placed it in his shirt pocket. Tomorrow he would ride to town and place the advertisement in the territorial newspaper. Someone would answer. They had to. He couldn't continue living like this, surrounded by emptiness that seemed to grow larger every day. Wind rattled the windows as he prepared for bed, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Thomas lay in the darkness listening to the storm rage outside, wondering what kind of person would be brave enough to answer his call for help. He had no way of knowing that in 3 days, someone would knock on his door who would change everything he thought he knew about starting over. But would that someone be exactly what he was looking for, or something completely unexpected? The knocking came during the worst part of the storm, so soft Thomas almost missed it over the wind screaming around his cabin. He'd been dozing in his chair by the fire, a half-eaten plate of beans growing cold on the table beside him. The sound made him jolt awake, heart pounding like he'd been caught stealing. Nobody traveled in weather like this unless they were running from something or toward something equally important. Thomas grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and moved carefully toward the front door. Living alone on a remote ranch meant you never opened your door without being ready for trouble. "Who's there?" he called through the thick wooden door. A voice answered, so quiet he had to strain to hear it over the storm. "Please, sir, I saw your notice about work. I need help." The voice belonged to a young woman, and it shook with more than just cold. Thomas hesitated, his hand on the door latch. He'd expected someone older, more experienced, maybe a widow looking for steady work. This voice sounded barely grown, frightened, and desperate in a way that made his chest tighten with concern. He opened the door and found himself staring at a girl who couldn't be more than 19, soaked to the bone and shivering in the doorway. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her pale face, and her brown eyes were wide with the kind of fear that comes from having nowhere else to go. She wore a thin coat that had seen better days, and underneath it, Thomas's breath caught. She was pregnant, maybe 4 or 5 months along, her condition obvious even through her wet clothes. This wasn't what he'd advertised for. This wasn't what he'd planned or wanted or knew how to handle. "I can work," she said quickly, seeing his shocked expression. "I'm strong, and I learn fast. I can clean and cook and mend clothes. I just need somewhere safe to stay until—" She touched her belly protectively, leaving the sentence unfinished. Lightning illuminated her face for a split second, and Thomas saw something that made his decision for him. Despite her fear and obvious desperation, her chin was raised with stubborn dignity. She wasn't begging, she was bargaining, offering her skills in exchange for shelter. There was strength in that, the kind of strength he recognized and respected. "Come in before you catch your death," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. She moved carefully, like someone who'd learned to be cautious around men, keeping her eyes down and her movements small. Water dripped from her clothes onto his floor, but Thomas didn't care. He grabbed a blanket from the back of his chair and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Sit by the fire. I'll make coffee." His voice came out gruffer than he intended, partly from surprise and partly from not knowing what else to say. She perched on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to fly at the first sign of danger. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go. The storm caught me on the road, and I saw your light." Thomas busied himself with the coffee pot, glad to have something to do with his hands while his mind raced. This woman was in trouble, the kind of trouble that followed you wherever you went. Taking her in meant complications he wasn't prepared for, questions from neighbors, and responsibilities he hadn't signed up for. But sending her back into the storm wasn't an option either. No decent person would turn away a pregnant woman on a night like this, regardless of the circumstances that brought her to his door. "What's your name?" he asked, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. "Elena Martinez," she said, wrapping her hands around the cup like it was the most precious thing in the world. "And I promise I won't be any trouble. I just need work until the baby comes. After that, I'll figure something else out." Thomas studied her face in the firelight. She was pretty in a quiet way, with high cheekbones and expressive eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. But it was her voice that caught his attention. Educated, well-spoken, not what he'd expected from someone showing up desperate on his doorstep. "Where are you from?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. Elena's hands tightened on the coffee cup. Back east. Philadelphia. But that's behind me now. The way she said it made it clear she wouldn't be saying more about her past, at least not tonight. The storm continued raging outside, but inside the cabin felt different somehow. Warmer, more alive, like having another heartbeat in the room had awakened something that had been sleeping. Thomas found himself really looking at his home for the first time in months, seeing it through Elena's eyes. The dust on the shelves, the dishes piled in the sink, the general air of abandonment that clung to everything. "The work's not easy," he said finally. "This is a working ranch, not some fancy house in town. Days start early and end late, and there's always something that needs doing."
Elena nodded eagerly.
"I'm not afraid of hard work. I grew up helping my mother run a boarding house before." She stopped herself, color rising in her cheeks. Before what? Thomas wondered, but he didn't push. Everyone had secrets, and this girl clearly had more than most. The important thing was whether she could do the job and whether he could trust her around his home and belongings. "We'll try it for a week," he said. "See how it works out for both of us." Relief flooded Elena's face, transforming it completely. For the first time since she'd appeared at his door, she looked young and hopeful instead of desperate and afraid. "Thank you," she breathed. "You won't regret this, I promise." But as Thomas showed her to the small room off the kitchen that had been meant for hired help, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just invited more than he bargained for into his carefully ordered world. What secrets was Elena Martinez running from, and would they follow her to his ranch? The morning sun painted golden stripes across Thomas's kitchen floor when Elena appeared in the doorway, moving like a cat afraid of waking a sleeping dog. She had braided her dark hair back tight, and Sarah's old apron hung loose around her thin frame. Thomas pretended not to watch as she studied every corner of the room, her brown eyes taking in details like she was memorizing an escape route. "Coffee's on the stove," Thomas said, not looking up from his newspaper. He had learned that direct attention made her nervous, like a wild horse ready to bolt. Elena poured herself a cup with steady hands, though he caught the slight tremor when she thought he wasn't looking. She moved to the window and stood there, one hand pressed against her growing belly, watching the ranch stretch out toward the mountains. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 15 years come winter." Thomas folded his paper and really looked at her then. In daylight, she seemed even younger than he'd first thought. "Built this place with my wife, Sarah. She picked this spot because she could see the sunrise from the kitchen window." Elena's fingers traced the windowsill. She had good taste. She did. Thomas stood and moved to the stove, ladling oatmeal into 2 bowls. "What about you? Where did you come from?" For a moment, Elena went completely still. Then she turned from the window, her chin lifting in a gesture he was beginning to recognize as pure stubbornness disguised as pride. "Denver," she said finally. "My father owned a small shop there. Sold fabric and sewing supplies to the ladies in town." Thomas set a bowl in front of her, noting how she didn't mention her father in present tense. "What kind of fabric?" A ghost of a smile crossed Elena's face. "Beautiful things. Silk from back east, cotton so fine it felt like clouds, lace that took months to make by hand. I used to sit in the corner and watch the ladies choose their materials, dreaming about the dresses they would become." "You know sewing then?" "I can make almost anything with needle and thread." Elena took a small bite of oatmeal, and Thomas was pleased to see her eat without the fear that had marked her first days. "Dresses, shirts, curtains, quilts. My mother taught me before she died, and I kept learning after." Thomas nodded toward a basket in the corner filled with shirts that needed mending. "I'm not much good with needlework. If you're willing, there's plenty that needs fixing around here." Elena followed his gaze and something shifted in her expression. Purpose, maybe, or the relief that comes from finding useful work to do. "I'd be glad to help." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the morning sun climbing higher and warming the kitchen. Thomas found himself stealing glances at the girl across his table, wondering about the story she wasn't telling. The way she held herself suggested someone used to hard work, but her hands were too soft for a life of real labor. Her speech was educated, careful, like someone who had been taught proper manners but was trying to hide it. "Elena," he said carefully. "The baby's father. Was he from Denver too?" Her spoon clattered against the bowl. "I'd rather not talk about him." "Fair enough." Thomas finished his breakfast and stood. "I've got fence work that needs doing. You rest if you need to, or there's books on the shelf if you're a reading woman." Elena looked up at him with surprise. "You have books?" Sarah loved to read. Poetry, novels, all sorts of things. Help yourself to whatever catches your fancy. After Thomas left for his morning work, Elena wandered to the bookshelf and ran her fingers along the spines. She pulled out a volume of poems and opened it carefully, finding a pressed flower between the pages. Sarah had been real, she realized. Not just a name Thomas spoke with sadness, but a woman who had loved books and flowers and sunrise views from kitchen windows. Elena settled into Sarah's rocking chair and began to read, one hand resting on her belly. The baby stirred inside her, a flutter of movement that made her smile despite everything. For the first time in months, she felt something that might eventually grow into peace. But peace was a luxury she wasn't sure she deserved, and the shadows of her past felt closer than the mountains on the horizon. 3 weeks later, Elena had settled into the rhythm of Thomas's ranch like she had been born to it. She woke before dawn to start bread rising, hummed while she swept floors that had known only boots and loneliness for too long, and spent afternoons mending clothes with stitches so neat they looked like machine work. Thomas found himself looking forward to coming inside after long days in the fields. The house smelled like baking bread and lemon soap instead of dust and silence. Elena had a way of moving through rooms that brought them back to life without changing anything important. She dusted Sarah's photographs with gentle hands and arranged wildflowers in the vase that had sat empty for 3 years. "You don't have to keep Sarah's things," Elena said one evening as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. She was hemming one of Thomas's shirts, her needle catching the lamplight with each precise stitch. Thomas looked up from the ledger where he recorded cattle sales and feed purchases. "They don't bother you?" "No." Elena's voice was soft but certain. She was part of making this place home. It would be wrong to erase that. Something warm settled in Thomas's chest at her words. He had worried that having another woman in Sarah's house might feel like betrayal, but Elena treated his wife's memory with the respect of someone who understood loss. "Tell me about her," Elena said, setting down her sewing. "What was she like?" Thomas closed his ledger and leaned back in his chair. Stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something. Could make a joke out of the worst situations. Sang while she cooked, even when she couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. Elena smiled. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Thomas studied Elena's face in the lamplight. "She would have liked you." Sarah had a soft spot for anyone who needed help, and she could spot a good heart from a mile away. A blush crept up Elena's neck. "You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you're kind to animals and gentle with delicate things. I know you read poetry and hum while you cook." Thomas's voice grew quieter. "And I know you're brave enough to start over when most people would give up." Elena's hand moved to her belly, where the baby was growing stronger every day. "I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn. Sometimes that's the same thing." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Thomas frowned, checking the clock on the mantel. Past 8 in the evening was late for visitors, especially with winter coming on and darkness falling early. "You expecting anyone?" Elena asked, her voice tight with the old fear that never quite left her.
No.
Thomas stood and moved toward the door, noting how Elena's hand had gone to her throat. "Stay here." But when Thomas opened the door, he found not the danger Elena feared, but something almost as unsettling. A woman stood on his porch, well-dressed in a traveling costume that had cost more than most people saw in a year. Her gray hair was pinned in perfect waves, and her sharp blue eyes took in every detail of Thomas's appearance with obvious disapproval. "Mr. McKenna?" Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I am Mrs. Catherine Whitmore. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Thomas felt his blood turn cold. Behind him, he heard Elena's sharp intake of breath and knew she had recognized the name even before seeing the face. The past had finally caught up with them, and it was wearing expensive gloves and a smile that promised nothing but trouble. The door slammed shut with such force that the coffee cups rattled on Thomas's kitchen table. Elena stood frozen by the window, her face white as fresh snow, watching a fancy black carriage roll up their dirt path. The horses were the kind rich folks owned, tall, sleek, and probably worth more than Thomas made in 2 years.
Elena.
Thomas called from where he was fixing a broken chair leg. "Someone coming to visit?" She didn't answer. Her hands pressed against her round belly like she was trying to protect the baby from something terrible. The way she backed away from the window reminded Thomas of a deer who'd caught the scent of a mountain lion. A man stepped down from the carriage. He wore a long dark coat that looked like it cost a fortune, and his boots shined like they'd never touched real dirt. Everything about him screamed money and power, but there was something mean in the way he walked toward their house, like a snake getting ready to strike. "Elena Rodriguez," the man called out in a voice smooth as honey but cold as winter ice. "I know you're in there, my dear. We have important things to discuss." Elena's breath came out in short little puffs. She grabbed the kitchen counter to steady herself, and Thomas could see her knuckles turn white from holding on so tight. "Who is that?" Thomas asked, setting down his hammer. Something about the stranger made every muscle in his body tense up, like when he sensed a storm coming.
Charles Whitmore, Elena whispered.
The name came out like she was spitting out something that tasted awful. He's the baby's father." Thomas felt his stomach drop like a stone thrown down a well. In all their weeks together, Elena had never told him the man's name. She'd just said the father didn't want them and left it at that. Now, seeing her terror, Thomas understood why she'd kept quiet. The knock on their door wasn't polite. It was the kind of pounding that demanded attention right now. "Open up, Elena. I've traveled a very long way to find you." Whitmore's voice carried a threat wrapped in fancy words. "And I don't plan to leave empty-handed." Elena shook her head frantically at Thomas. "Don't let him in," she begged. "Please, Thomas. He's not a good man." But Whitmore wasn't waiting for an invitation. The door handle turned, and he stepped inside like he owned the place. His pale blue eyes swept over their simple home with obvious disgust before landing on Elena. "There's my runaway bride," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You've led me quite a chase, darling. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me?" "I'm not your anything," Elena said, but her voice shook. "And I didn't ask you to follow me." Whitmore laughed, and the sound made Thomas's skin crawl. "Oh, my sweet, stupid girl. You're carrying my child. That makes you very much my concern." His gaze shifted to Thomas, looking him up and down like he was measuring a piece of livestock. "And who might you be?" "The hired help. Thomas McKenna. This is my ranch." Thomas stood up slowly, making sure to keep his body between Whitmore and Elena. "Elena works for me." "Works for you?" Whitmore's eyebrows shot up. "How quaint. Tell me, McKenna, did she mention she's having my baby? Did she tell you about our arrangement?" "She told me enough," Thomas said carefully. He could feel Elena trembling behind him, and it made his anger burn hotter. "Did she tell you she ran away on our wedding day? Left me standing at the altar like a fool in front of half of Denver's finest families." Whitmore's voice turned sharp as broken glass. "Did she mention the scandal she caused? The embarrassment?" Elena made a small sound like a wounded animal. "You were already married," she said. "I found out about your wife, about your 3 children. You lied to me about everything. Details, Whitmore waved his hand like he was brushing away a fly. My wife and I have an understanding. You would have been well taken care of, Elena. You would have had a nice little house, pretty dresses, everything a girl like you could want. Everything except respect. Elena shot back, finding her courage. Everything except the truth. Whitmore's face darkened. Respect? You want to talk about respect? You're nothing but a poor Mexican girl who got lucky enough to catch my attention. I offered you more than you deserved. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. I think you should leave. Leave. Whitmore laughed again. I'm not going anywhere without what belongs to me. That child she's carrying is mine by blood and by law. And so is she, whether she likes it or not. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Outside, Thomas could hear storm clouds building, but the real storm was standing right in his kitchen. I'm not going anywhere with you, Elena said, her voice getting stronger. I'd rather die first. That can be arranged, Whitmore said softly, and Thomas knew they were in serious trouble. Thomas moved so fast that Whitmore stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own fancy boots. In one smooth motion, Thomas grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall and pointed it straight at the stranger's chest. I said you should leave, Thomas repeated, his voice deadly calm. And I meant right now. Whitmore raised his hands, but his smile never wavered. Now, McKenna. There's no need for violence. I'm simply here to collect what belongs to me. Nothing here belongs to you, Thomas said. The rifle didn't shake in his hands. He'd been hunting since he was 12 years old, and Whitmore was a much bigger target than any deer. The law might disagree with you, Whitmore said. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. I have papers here that say otherwise. Legal documents that prove my rights as the father of that child.
Elena gasped.
What papers? What are you talking about? Paternity claims, my dear. Signed statements from witnesses who saw us together. Financial records showing I supported you during our courtship. Whitmore's eyes glittered like a snake's. Everything needed to prove that child is mine and that you are unfit to raise it alone. She's not alone, Thomas said through gritted teeth. Isn't she? Whitmore looked around their simple cabin with obvious scorn. A pregnant, unmarried woman living with a stranger? Working as a servant? The courts will be very interested to hear about these arrangements. Thomas felt Elena sag against the wall behind him. He could hear her crying softly, and it made him want to pull the trigger right then and there. You see, McKenna, I'm not just any man, Whitmore continued, apparently enjoying himself. I'm Charles Whitmore of Whitmore Industries. I own 3 silver mines, 2 banks, and half the politicians in Colorado Territory. When I want something, I get it. And I want my child. Why? Elena asked through her tears. You didn't want us before. You threw me out like garbage when I found out about your wife. Because that child carries my blood? Whitmore snapped, his calm mask slipping. Because I need an heir, and my wife has proven inadequate in that department. Because what's mine stays mine, whether I want it or not. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. Get out. Right now. Before I do something we'll both regret. You'll regret it more than I will, Whitmore said. Shoot me and you'll hang for murder. Then what happens to your precious Elena? What happens to my child when she's all alone in the world? The baby isn't yours, Elena said suddenly, her voice filled with desperate hope. It can't be. It was just one time. Once is all it takes, darling, Whitmore said cruelly. And I remember that night very clearly. You were so eager to please, so grateful for my attention. Elena flinched like he'd struck her. Thomas could see her faith in herself crumbling, and it broke his heart. Elena, Thomas said softly, not taking his eyes off Whitmore. Go into the bedroom. Lock the door. I'm not leaving you alone with him, she said. Go. Now. Thomas's voice carried an authority he rarely used. Please. Elena hesitated, then slowly backed toward the bedroom. But just as she reached the door, Whitmore called out one more time. "I'll give you 3 days to think it over, Elena. 3 days to come to your senses. After that, I'll be back with the sheriff and those papers, and I'll take what's mine whether you cooperate or not." His smile turned cruel. "And McKenna? I'll make sure everyone in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman you've been harboring." Thomas's rifle never wavered. 3 seconds to get off my land before I put a bullet in you." Whitmore tipped his hat mockingly. "Until next time, my dear," he called to Elena. "Don't keep me waiting too long." He walked out the door as calmly as he'd entered, leaving behind the smell of expensive cologne and the promise of terrible things to come. As soon as the carriage rolled away, Thomas set down his rifle with shaking hands. Elena collapsed into a chair, sobbing like her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. "He's going to take my baby," she cried. "He's going to take my baby, and there's nothing I can do to stop him." Thomas knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his. They were ice-cold and trembling like autumn leaves. "No," he said firmly. "No, he's not. I won't let him." "You don't understand," Elena said. "He has money, power, lawyers, and I'm nobody. I'm just a poor girl who made a terrible mistake." "You're not nobody," Thomas said, "and we'll figure this out. Together." But even as he said the words, Thomas wondered if they were both fooling themselves. How could two ordinary people fight someone like Charles Whitmore? Outside, the storm clouds finally opened up, and rain began to pound against their windows like angry fists. The cabin door slammed shut behind Whitmore, but the echo of his cruel words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Elena stood frozen by the window, watching his fancy carriage disappear into the evening shadows. Her hands pressed so tightly against her swollen belly that her knuckles turned white as winter snow. "He's coming back," she whispered, her voice breaking like thin ice under heavy boots. "Men like Charles Whitmore don't just give up and walk away." Thomas set his rifle against the wall and moved toward her, but stopped when he saw how she flinched at the sound of his footsteps. The fear in her dark eyes cut through him sharper than any blade. This wasn't the same brave girl who had swept his floors and hummed while she worked. This was someone who had been hunted before.
Elena.
His voice was soft as morning mist. "Look at me." She turned slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks like rain on a dusty road. "You don't understand what kind of man he is. Charles has money, power, friends in high places. He can make papers appear that say whatever he wants them to say." The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows and making the lamplight dance across the walls. Thomas could smell snow coming in the air, the kind of storm that could trap a person for days. But the real storm was already inside their home, tearing apart the peace they had built together like a tornado ripping through a wheat field. "Tell me about him," Thomas said, settling into the chair across from where she stood. "Tell me how you met Charles Whitmore." Elena's hand moved to her throat, touching a small scar Thomas had never noticed before. "I was working in his mother's house in Denver. Just a girl from nowhere, cleaning fancy rooms and polishing silver that cost more than my family ever had." She began to pace back and forth across the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the wooden boards. "Charles noticed me right away, said I was different from the other girls, special. He brought me flowers and chocolates, told me I deserved better than scrubbing floors for pennies." Thomas felt anger building in his chest like hot coals. He had heard this story before, in different words but always the same ending. Rich men who saw poor girls as toys to play with and throw away. "I believed every word," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each step. "When he said he loved me, when he promised we would run away together and start fresh somewhere new. I was so lonely, Thomas. My parents were dead. I had no brothers or sisters, no one who cared if I lived or died." She stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "That's what men like Charles count on. They find girls who are hungry for love, and they feed them just enough hope to make them do foolish things." The baby kicked hard inside her, making Elena gasp and press both hands to her side. Thomas jumped up from his chair, ready to help, but she waved him away with a weak smile. "She's restless tonight," Elena said, rubbing circles on her belly. "Maybe she can feel the danger coming." "What happened when you told him about the baby?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer would make him want to punch something. Elena's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He laughed, actually laughed, as if I had told him a funny joke. Then he offered me money to take care of the problem, as he called it. When I refused, he got angry. She touched the scar on her throat again, and Thomas understood without words where it had come from. His hands clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. "He threw me out that very night," Elena whispered. "Told his mother I had stolen from them. Made sure no decent family in Denver would hire me. I had to leave the city just to find work." The fire in the stove crackled and popped, the only sound in the suddenly quiet room. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Snow had started to fall, tiny flakes that would soon become a blizzard. "That's why you were so scared when you first came here," he said, understanding flooding through him like water through a broken dam. "You thought I might be like him." Elena nodded, fresh tears rolling down her cheeks. "Every man I met after Charles, I wondered if he had the same cruel heart hidden behind kind words. It took me weeks to believe you were different." Thomas turned from the window and walked back to her, moving slowly so she wouldn't be afraid. "I am different, Elena, and this is your home now. Our home. No one is going to take that away from us." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas felt doubt creeping into his heart like winter cold seeping through cracks in the walls. Whitmore had money and connections. Thomas had nothing but a small ranch and a fierce desire to protect the woman he had grown to love. "What if he brings the law with him next time?" Elena asked, voicing the fear that was eating at both of them. "What if he has papers that say the baby belongs to him?" Thomas took her hands in his, feeling how cold and small they were. "Then we'll fight him. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we'll fight him." Outside, the wind howled like a wild animal, and the snow began to fall harder, covering their world in white. But inside the warm cabin, two people who had found each other in their darkest moments held on to hope like a lifeline in a raging storm. The blizzard lasted 3 days, turning their small ranch into a world made entirely of white. Elena spent the long hours knitting tiny clothes for the baby, while Thomas carved a wooden cradle from an old oak tree that had fallen the previous spring. Neither of them spoke about Whitmore or the danger that waited beyond the storm, but it hung between them like a shadow they couldn't shake. On the 4th morning, Elena woke to the sound of Thomas chopping wood outside, the steady rhythm of his axe cutting through the crisp winter air. She stretched and placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby's strong kicks against her ribs. "Good morning, little one," she whispered. "Your papa is working hard to keep us warm." The word papa slipped out before she could stop it, and Elena felt her cheeks grow hot with embarrassment. Thomas wasn't the baby's father, not really, even though he had been more of a father than Charles Whitmore could ever be. She pulled on her warmest dress and thick woolen stockings, then made her way to the kitchen to start breakfast. Through the frosted window, she could see Thomas stacking split logs against the side of the barn, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. The coffee was just beginning to boil when she heard the sound that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Horses, several of them moving fast across the snow-covered ground toward their cabin. Elena's hands began to shake as she set down the coffee pot. She pressed her face to the window and saw them coming over the hill like dark wolves against the white landscape. Charles Whitmore rode in front, his expensive coat black as midnight, followed by 2 other men she didn't recognize. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice high and sharp with panic. He looked up from his wood chopping, saw the riders, and immediately dropped his axe. In 3 quick steps he was at the cabin door, pushing it open and grabbing his rifle from where it hung on the wall. "Get away from the windows," he told Elena, his voice calm but firm. Go sit by the fire and stay there no matter what happens. But Elena couldn't move. Her feet seemed to be nailed to the floor, and her heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. The baby inside her kicked frantically, as if she too could sense the danger approaching. Whitmore and his men stopped their horses right in front of the cabin, close enough that Elena could see the cruel smile on Charles's handsome face. He looked exactly the same as the day he had thrown her out into the Denver streets, all polish and charm hiding a heart made of stone. "McKenna!" Whitmore called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow. "I've come to collect what belongs to me." Thomas stepped onto the porch, his rifle held ready but not pointed at anyone yet. Elena could see the muscles in his shoulders tense tight as wire, ready for whatever might come next. "Nothing here belongs to you, Whitmore," Thomas replied, his words cutting through the cold air like knife blades. "Best you turn around and ride back where you came from." Whitmore laughed, the same awful sound Elena remembered from her nightmares. "Oh, but you're wrong about that. Very wrong indeed." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, waving it in the air like a flag of victory. "I have here a court order, signed by Judge Harrison himself. It states that the child Elena Vasquez carries is my legal offspring, and therefore my property to claim." Elena felt the world spinning around her like a child's top. Her maiden name, spoken aloud after all these months, sounded foreign and strange. But worse than that was the word property, as if her baby was nothing more than a lost cow to be returned to its rightful owner. "Property." Thomas's voice was deadly quiet, the way it got when he was truly angry. "You talking about a human child like it's a piece of livestock?" "I'm talking about my blood and my responsibility," Whitmore shot back. "That woman ran away before I could make proper arrangements for the child's care. Now I'm here to set things right." Elena found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Liar!" All three men turned to look at her through the window. Charles's smile grew wider and uglier. "Ah, Elena, still as beautiful as ever, I see. Motherhood suits you." She forced herself to walk to the door, to stand beside Thomas on the porch even though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "You're a liar, Charles Whitmore. You never wanted this baby. You told me to get rid of it, remember?" "A moment of shock, nothing more," Whitmore said smoothly. "A man needs time to adjust to such news. But I've had months to think it over, and I've decided to do the right thing." "The right thing?" Elena's voice grew stronger, fed by anger that had been building inside her for months. "The right thing would have been not abandoning me in the first place. The right thing would have been caring about what happened to us." Thomas stepped closer to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cold air. "The ladies made her feelings clear. Time for you to leave." "Lady," one of Whitmore's companions, a thin man with cold eyes, let out a nasty chuckle. "Is that what she told you she was?" Elena felt shame wash over her like dirty water, the same shame that had followed her from Denver to this small Montana ranch. But then she felt Thomas's hand brush against hers, warm and steady and real. "Yeah," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the snow like thunder. "That's exactly what she is. A lady who deserves respect, not threats from men who wouldn't know honor if it bit them on the behind." The standoff stretched out like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap at any moment. Elena could hear her heart beating in her ears, could feel the baby moving restlessly inside her, as if sensing the tension in the air. Finally, Whitmore folded his paper and put it back in his coat. "This isn't over, McKenna. I'll be back with the sheriff and proper legal authority. That child is mine by rights, and I intend to claim what's mine." As the three men turned their horses and rode away, disappearing into the white landscape like bad dreams fading in daylight, Elena felt Thomas's arm come around her shoulders, strong and protective and warm. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, leading her back inside the cabin. "Whatever it takes, we'll keep our family together." But as Elena settled into her chair by the fire, feeling the baby's worried movements inside her, She wondered if love and determination would be enough to fight the power that money could buy. The sharp crack of thunder woke Thomas from his restless sleep, but it wasn't the storm that made his heart race. It was Elena's quiet gasp from the next room. He bolted upright, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor as another sound reached his ears, the unmistakable rhythm of labor pains beginning. "Thomas?" Elena called softly, her voice tight with controlled fear. The April storm had arrived 3 days early, just like the baby seemed determined to do. Lightning flashed outside their bedroom window, casting dancing shadows across the walls as he quickly pulled on his pants and shirt. When he pushed open her door, Elena was sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other cradled beneath her swollen belly. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her nightgown was damp with perspiration despite the cool spring air. "How long?" he asked, moving to kneel beside her. "Since midnight, maybe a little before." She tried to smile, but another wave of pain made her grip his hand so tightly he winced. "They're getting stronger, Thomas. Much stronger." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and sending rain against the glass in sheets. Thomas glanced toward the door, calculating the distance to town and Doc Morrison's house. In good weather, it was a 40-minute ride. In this storm, with the creek likely flooding and the roads turning to mud, it could take twice that long. "I need to get the doctor," he said, starting to rise, but Elena's grip on his hand tightened. "Don't leave me," she whispered, and for the first time since he'd known her, she sounded truly frightened. "Please, Thomas, what if something goes wrong? What if the baby comes before you get back?" Another contraction seized her, and she doubled over with a soft cry that cut through his heart like a blade. He'd helped birth calves and foals plenty of times, but this was different. This was Elena, and the tiny life they'd both grown to love before it was even born. "All right," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "All right, we'll manage. Women have been having babies for thousands of years without doctors, right? We can do this." Elena nodded, but her eyes were wide with uncertainty. "Sarah used to tell me stories about birthing her children. She said the key was to stay calm, to trust your body to know what to do." The mention of his late wife's name brought an unexpected comfort. Thomas could almost hear Sarah's gentle voice, feel her steady presence in the room. She'd always been the strong one during emergencies, the one who kept her head when others panicked. "What else did she say?" Thomas asked, helping Elena stand as she tried to walk through another contraction. "She said labor was like a storm. It felt overwhelming, but it had its own rhythm. You had to work with it, not fight against it." Elena paused, breathing deeply as the pain subsided. "And she said the most important thing was to have someone you trusted beside you, someone who wouldn't let fear take over." Thomas felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "We're going to bring this baby into the world together, and everything's going to be fine." But as the hours passed and the storm outside grew more violent, Thomas began to question his own confidence. Elena's labor intensified, and the contractions came closer together. She walked when she could, gripping his arm as they paced the small cabin. When walking became too difficult, she knelt beside the bed, her face buried in the quilt Sarah had sewn years before. "Something's different," Elena gasped during a particularly strong contraction. "I feel like I need to push." Thomas's mouth went dry. He'd read enough in Sarah's old medical books to know that the urge to push meant the baby was coming soon. There was no time to second-guess, no opportunity to fetch help. It was just the two of them, and a new life demanding to be born. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice calm despite the fear churning in his stomach. Elena looked up at him with complete trust in her eyes. "Help me get ready," she said. "Our daughter is coming." They worked together with the quiet efficiency of people who'd learned to rely on each other. Thomas built up the fire until the room was warm and bright, then boiled water and gathered clean towels. Elena changed into an old nightgown, one she didn't mind ruining, and settled onto the bed with pillows propped behind her back. "I can see her head," Thomas said in amazement as the next contraction peaked. "Elena, I can see our baby's head." "Really?" Elena's exhausted face lit up with wonder. "Is she all right? Does she look healthy?" "She's perfect," Thomas said, and he meant it. The tiny head was covered with dark hair, and even in the dim lamplight, he could see the delicate features that would soon become familiar. "One more push, Elena. One more and she'll be here." Elena bore down with all her strength, and suddenly the baby slipped into Thomas's waiting hands. Slippery and warm and absolutely beautiful. For a moment, the infant was silent, and Thomas felt his heart stop. Then she opened her mouth and let out a cry that filled the cabin with the sound of life itself. "She's here," Thomas whispered, carefully lifting the baby toward her mother. "Elena, she's here and she's perfect." Elena reached for her daughter with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, my beautiful girl." The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath to welcome this new life. Thomas wrapped both mother and baby in warm blankets, then sat beside them on the bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. "Look at her fingers," Elena marveled, touching the tiny hand that had already wrapped around her own finger. "They're so small, so perfect. Just like her mother," Thomas said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Elena's damp forehead. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the new family sat together in the peaceful aftermath of the storm. The baby, their baby, slept contentedly in her mother's arms, oblivious to the danger and uncertainty that had marked her beginning. But even in this moment of pure joy, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was temporary. Somewhere out there, Charles Whitmore was probably planning his next move. The man who'd abandoned Elena in her time of need would surely come looking for what he considered his property now that the child was born. Thomas looked down at the sleeping infant and felt a fierce determination settle in his chest. Whatever came next, whatever threats they faced, he would protect this family with his life. The baby stirred slightly, and her dark eyes opened for just a moment, seeming to look right at him. "What do you think, little princess?" he whispered. "Ready to take on the world?" The peaceful morning after Sarah's birth shattered like glass when the sound of approaching horses cut through the birdsong. Thomas was in the kitchen, trying to figure out how to make coffee with shaking hands while Elena rested with the baby, when he heard the familiar arrogant tone of Charles Whitmore's voice carrying across the yard. "I know she's here, McKenna. Don't even think about lying to me." Thomas set down the coffee pot and moved to the window, his blood turning cold at what he saw. Whitmore sat astride a fine black horse, but he wasn't alone this time. Two men flanked him, one wearing a badge that caught the morning sunlight, the other dressed in the expensive suit of a lawyer or businessman. Official papers were visible in Whitmore's gloved hand, and his smile was the kind that promised trouble. "Elena," Thomas called quietly, not wanting to wake the baby but needing to warn her. "We have visitors." Elena appeared in the doorway, the baby cradled against her chest, her face pale but determined. "I heard," she said simply. "I've been expecting this." The knock on the door came hard and demanding, nothing like Elena's desperate tap all those months ago. Thomas opened it to find Whitmore's cold blue eyes staring at him with barely concealed triumph. "McKenna," Whitmore said, tipping his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and mocking. "I believe congratulations are in order. I hear you've welcomed a new addition to your household. What do you want, Whitmore?" Thomas kept his voice level, though every instinct screamed at him to slam the door in the man's face. "What I want is simple justice," Whitmore replied, unfolding the papers in his hand. "I have here a court order demanding paternity testing, financial responsibility documents, and legal guardianship papers. That child is mine by blood, and I intend to claim what belongs to me." Elena stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance despite the exhaustion that marked her features. "She doesn't belong to you, Charles. She belongs to herself, and to the family that will love and protect her. Whitmore's laugh was sharp and cruel. Family? You mean this charade you've been playing? Elena, my dear, you can't seriously think that marrying some dirt farmer legitimizes your situation. That child needs a proper name, a proper home, proper opportunities, things I can provide. She has a name, Elena said firmly.
Sarah Elena McKenna.
And this is her home. The sheriff stepped forward, his expression uncomfortable but official. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but these papers are legal and binding. Mr. Whitmore has rights as the biological father, and the court has ordered. The court has ordered what exactly? Thomas interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. To tear a newborn baby from her mother's arms? To hand her over to a man who abandoned both of them when it was convenient? To ensure the child's welfare, the lawyer spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and practiced. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to provide for the child's education, her social standing, her future prospects, advantages that cannot be found on a remote ranch with questionable parentage. Elena's face flushed with anger. Questionable parentage? You mean because I'm not married to him? Because I dared to find happiness with a man who actually wanted me? I always wanted you, Whitmore said, his voice taking on the honey-smooth tone Thomas remembered from their previous encounter. I tried to do right by you, Elena. I offered marriage, a life of comfort and respectability. You're the one who ran away. You offered marriage to your mistress after your engagement to the banker's daughter was announced in the papers. Elena shot back, her voice shaking with fury. You wanted to keep me hidden away while you lived your respectable life with your respectable wife. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, clearly not enjoying his role in this domestic drama. Look, folks, I don't want to be here any more than you want me here. But the law is the law, and these papers are properly signed and sealed. Thomas studied the documents, his mind racing. These papers assume the child is Whitmore's. Has anyone actually proven that? Don't be ridiculous, Whitmore snapped. Of course she's mine. The timing is obvious. And Elena herself admitted. I admitted I was foolish enough to trust you, Elena interrupted. But timing proves nothing. And I'm a married woman now, Thomas. In the eyes of the law, doesn't that make you Sarah's legal father? The lawyer frowned, clearly not having considered this angle. Well, technically, if the marriage predates the birth, and if there's no proof of adultery. There's no adultery because there's no relationship, Thomas said firmly. Elena is my wife, and Sarah is my daughter. If Mr. Whitmore wants to challenge that, he's welcome to try, but he'll need more than his word and some hastily drawn-up papers. Whitmore's composure cracked slightly. Don't try to play legal games with me, McKenna. I have resources, connections, influence. I can make life very difficult for you. And I have something you don't, Thomas replied, moving to stand beside Elena, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. I have the truth, and I have people who know the kind of man I am versus the kind of man you are. As if summoned by his words, the sound of more approaching horses filled the air. But these riders were different. Neighbors Thomas recognized, people from town who'd heard about the confrontation and come to see what was happening. Doc Morrison was among them, his medical bag in hand and his face set in lines of disapproval as he took in the scene. Charles Whitmore, Doc Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd delivered half the babies in the territory. I heard you were making trouble for the McKenna family. That's a mighty poor way to welcome a new baby into the world. This is a private family matter, Doctor, Whitmore said stiffly. Is it now? Doc Morrison dismounted and walked toward the porch. Funny thing about family matters, they tend to involve actual family members. I've been doctoring in these parts for 30 years, and I've learned to recognize a good family when I see one. He gestured toward Elena and Thomas. This woman has been well cared for, respected, and loved. This baby was born into a home where she's wanted and welcomed. And this man has shown more genuine fatherhood in the past 24 hours than most men show in a lifetime. More neighbors had gathered now, forming a loose circle around Whitmore and his companions. Their faces were hard, unwelcoming, the expressions of people who'd seen enough of the world to recognize a bully when they encountered one. "The way I see it," said Martha Henderson, the preacher's wife, "is that some folks talk about doing right and others just do it. We've all seen how Thomas has cared for Elena, how he's treated her with respect and kindness. That's the mark of a real man, not fancy papers and threats." Whitmore looked around at the growing crowd, his confidence clearly shaken. "This is ridiculous. I have legal rights." "You have the right to leave," Sheriff Patterson said quietly, and Thomas was surprised to hear the lawman's tone had changed. "And frankly, Mr. Whitmore, I'd advise you to take it. These are good people, and that's a beautiful baby who deserves to grow up in peace." "You can't be serious," Whitmore sputtered. "You're a law officer. You have to enforce these documents." "I have to enforce the law," Patterson agreed. "But I also have to use my judgment about what serves justice. And separating a baby from a loving family to satisfy the ego of a man who abandoned them both? That doesn't strike me as justice." The crowd murmured agreement, and Thomas felt Elena's hand slip into his. Together, they watched as Whitmore's certainty crumbled in the face of community disapproval. "This isn't over," Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'll be back with better lawyers, with federal marshals if necessary." "You do that," Thomas said calmly, "but you'll find the same thing waiting for you. A family that chose each other, supported by people who understand what love really means." As Whitmore and his companions rode away, baby Sarah chose that moment to wake up and let out a lusty cry, as if adding her own voice to the victory. The crowd laughed, and Elena lifted her daughter higher so everyone could see. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena said, her voice strong and clear, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Elena McKenna, the newest member of our family." The cheer that went up from the gathered neighbors echoed across the ranch, a sound of pure joy and acceptance that promised this little girl would never lack for people who cared about her welfare. But even as Thomas smiled and accepted congratulations, he couldn't shake the feeling that Whitmore's threat wasn't empty. The man had too much pride to accept this defeat quietly, and men like him always had more tricks up their sleeves. Still, looking at his wife and daughter surrounded by friends and neighbors, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The unshakable certainty that some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The baby's crying cut through the morning air like a knife through butter. Elena stood on the porch holding little Sarah, but her hands shook so badly that Thomas worried she might drop their daughter. 3 men on horseback were riding toward their house, and the man in front wore a fancy black coat that cost more than most people made in a year. "That's him," Elena whispered. Her face had gone white as fresh snow. "That's Charles." Thomas felt his stomach drop like a stone thrown down a well. He'd been expecting this day for months, but hoping it would never come. The man who had left Elena alone and scared was finally here, and he'd brought friends. Charles Whitmore climbed down from his horse like he owned the whole world. His boots were so shiny they reflected the sun, and his mustache was waxed into perfect points. Behind him, 2 other men stayed on their horses. One wore a badge that caught the light. The other carried a leather bag full of papers. Well, Charles said, his voice smooth as honey but with something mean underneath. "Little Elena, playing house in the middle of nowhere." Elena stepped behind Thomas, but she kept her chin up. "I'm not playing anything, Charles. This is my home." Charles laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the kind of laugh that made dogs hide under porches. "Your home? My dear girl, you seem to have forgotten something very important." His eyes moved to the baby in Elena's arms. "That child belongs to me." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest like flood water. Nobody talked to his wife that way. Nobody looked at his daughter like she was something to be owned. "The only thing that belongs to you is the horse you rode in on," he said, "and you're welcome to ride it right back out." The man with the badge shifted in his saddle. Now hold on there, mister. We're here on official business. Official business? Thomas kept his voice calm, but his hand moved closer to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. What kind of official business involves scaring a woman who just had a baby? Charles pulled out a thick envelope from his coat. The paper inside rustled like dead leaves. I have documents here that prove I'm the father of that child. Legal papers that say I have rights. Elena made a small sound like a wounded animal. Thomas wanted to comfort her, but he couldn't take his eyes off the three men. Something about this felt wrong, like milk that had gone sour. What kind of rights? Thomas asked. The right to claim my child, Charles said. The right to give her a proper name and a proper home. The right to raise her as she deserves to be raised. She has a proper name, Elena said, her voice getting stronger.
Sarah Elena McKenna.
And she has a proper home right here. Charles's face twisted with anger. McKenna? You married this dirt farmer. Thomas took a step forward. Careful how you talk about my wife. Your wife. Charles spat on the ground. Do you know what kind of woman you married? Do you know what she did? I know she's brave, Thomas said. I know she works harder than any three people I've ever met. I know she loves that baby more than her own life. The man with the papers cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore has legal standing here. Blood relation gives him certain rights under territorial law. Thomas felt the world tilt sideways. He'd heard of cases like this before. Rich men who could buy lawyers and judges. Poor women who had no one to speak for them. But Elena surprised everyone. She walked down the porch steps, still holding Sarah, and stood right in front of Charles. You want to talk about rights? Let's talk about rights. Charles smiled like a cat that had cornered a mouse. Finally, some sense. You had the right to stay when I told you about the baby, Elena said. You had the right to marry me when I begged you to. You had the right to be a man instead of a coward. Charles's smile disappeared. Now see here. But you chose to run, Elena continued. You chose to leave me with nothing. You chose to let me believe I meant nothing to you. The baby started crying again, as if she could feel the tension in the air. Elena rocked her gently, and Sarah quieted down. So don't talk to me about rights, Elena said. You gave up every right you had the day you walked away. Charles's face turned red as a sunset. That child carries my blood. Blood doesn't make a father, Thomas said, moving to stand beside Elena. Being there makes a father. Getting up in the middle of the night when she cries. Worrying when she's sick. Teaching her right from wrong. That's what makes a father. The man with the badge looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing between Charles and Elena, like he was trying to figure out who was telling the truth. Look, the badge man said. Maybe we can work something out here. Some kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Elena asked. Charles straightened his coat. I'm prepared to offer you money. Enough to start over somewhere else. All you have to do is give me the child. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. You think you can buy my daughter? I think I can provide for her better than this. Charles waved his hand at the ranch. Look around you. What kind of life is this for a child? No schools, no culture, no future. Thomas felt something break inside him. Not break apart, but break open. Like ice breaking up in spring, making room for something new to grow. You're right, he said quietly. Elena looked at him with shock. Charles smiled with triumph. This isn't much to look at, Thomas continued. Just a small ranch in the middle of nowhere. But it's honest work, clean air, room to grow, and most important of all, it's filled with love. He put his arm around Elena's shoulders. That little girl will grow up knowing she's wanted, knowing she's loved, knowing that her parents chose each other and chose her every single day. Charles pulled out a roll of money thick as a man's fist. How much? Name your price. There is no price, Elena said. She's not for sale. The man with the papers spoke up again. Ma'am, I have to tell you, these documents are pretty official. If this goes to court. Thomas felt fear creep up his spine like a spider. Court meant lawyers. Lawyers meant money. Money was something they didn't have much of. But then something unexpected happened. The sound of more horses coming up the road made everyone turn around. Doc Morrison rode up first, his black medical bag bouncing on his saddle. Behind him came Sheriff Patterson from town, and behind the sheriff came half a dozen neighbors that Thomas barely knew by name. Word traveled fast in ranch country, and trouble traveled even faster. "Heard there might be some difficulty out here," Doc Morrison said as he climbed down from his horse. He was a small man with gentle hands, but his voice carried the weight of 30 years delivering babies and patching up broken bones. Charles looked annoyed at the interruption. "This is a private family matter, Doctor." "Is it now?" Doc Morrison walked over to Elena and smiled at baby Sarah. "Well, I delivered this little one just a few weeks ago. Prettiest baby I've seen in years. Healthy as a horse, too." Sheriff Patterson tipped his hat to Elena.
Mom.
"Heard someone was causing you trouble." The man with the badge who had come with Charles shifted nervously. "Sheriff, I'm Deputy Marshal Crawford from Helena. This is official territorial business." "Is that so?" Sheriff Patterson looked at the papers Crawford was holding. "Mind if I take a look at those documents?" Charles stepped forward. "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but this doesn't involve local law enforcement. When someone comes into my county and upsets good people, it involves me plenty," Sheriff Patterson said. His voice was friendly, but there was steel underneath it. While the lawmen talked, Doc Morrison examined the papers over their shoulders. Thomas noticed the old doctor's eyebrows going up higher and higher as he read. "Interesting," Doc Morrison said finally. "These papers claim paternity based on the mother's statement. But I don't see any sworn testimony from the lady herself." Elena looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," Doc Morrison said with a slight smile, "that someone made up your words for you. According to these papers, you swore under oath that Mr. Whitmore is the father. But you never actually swore any such thing, did you?" Elena shook her head. "I never spoke to any judge or lawyer." Sheriff Patterson frowned at Deputy Crawford. "These papers aren't worth the ink they're printed with if the mother never gave testimony." Charles's face was getting redder by the minute. "That's just a technicality. The law is made up of technicalities," Doc Morrison said. "And here's another one. According to territorial statute, a married woman has the right to determine who raises her children, especially when she's wed to a man of good standing." One of the neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson, spoke up. "Thomas McKenna is as fine a man as you'll find in 3 counties. That girl and her baby couldn't ask for better." Other voices joined in. "Known Thomas for years, honest as the day is long. Saw how he cared for his first wife when she was sick. That little family is blessed to have each other." Charles looked around at the growing crowd with growing panic. This wasn't going the way he'd planned at all. "Now hold on," he said loudly. "I have rights here. That's my blood. My child. Your blood." Mrs. Henderson's voice could have frozen water in July. "Where was your blood when that girl was walking the streets with nowhere to go? Where was your blood when she was working her fingers raw to keep herself fed?" Another neighbor, a weathered rancher named Jim Walsh, stepped forward. "I've seen plenty of men claim children when it suited them, usually when there's something to be gained." Charles pulled out his roll of money again. "I'm offering to provide for the child. I can give her advantages these people never could." "What kind of advantages?" Elena asked. "The advantage of having a father who only shows up when he wants something? The advantage of being raised by someone who thinks love can be bought." Doc Morrison was still studying the papers. "There's something else interesting here. These documents are dated last week, but they reference a birth that happened 3 weeks ago. How did Mr. Whitmore know about the birth if he's been in Helena this whole time?" Charles went very quiet. Too quiet. Sheriff Patterson caught the silence. That's a good question. Document Mr. Whitmore? How did you hear about the baby? I have my sources. What kind of sources? The sheriff pressed.
Elena gasped.
Mrs. Murphy, the woman who runs the boarding house in town. She was asking all sorts of questions when I went for supplies last week. Gertrude Murphy? Mrs. Henderson snorted. That woman would sell gossip to the devil himself if the price was right. Thomas felt pieces clicking together in his mind. You've been watching us. Having us watched. Charles didn't deny it. I had a right to know about my child. You had a right to be here from the beginning, Elena shot back. You gave up that right when you told me to take care of the problem and never darken your door again. The crowd murmured angrily. Those were ugly words, the kind that revealed a man's true character. Deputy Crawford looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Whitmore, if these papers aren't legitimate, they're perfectly legitimate, Charles snapped. I paid good money for them. Sheriff Patterson and Doc Morrison exchanged glances. You paid for legal documents? The sheriff asked slowly. Charles realized his mistake too late. I meant I paid legal fees, of course, but the damage was done. Everyone could see the truth now. Charles hadn't come here out of love or responsibility. He'd come with fake papers and bribed officials, trying to steal a child from parents who loved her. Doc Morrison handed the papers back to Deputy Crawford. These documents are fraudulent. I'd be very careful about trying to enforce them. Crawford looked at the papers, then at Charles, then at the growing crowd of angry neighbors. Maybe we should head back to town and sort this out properly. There's nothing to sort out, Elena said firmly. My daughter has a father. A real father who chose to be her father, not just someone who happened to contribute to her creation. Thomas pulled Elena closer, and baby Sarah made a small, contented sound in her sleep. They looked like what they were, a family that belonged together. Charles made one last desperate attempt. That child deserves better than this. She deserves a name, a position in society. She has a name, Thomas said quietly.
Sarah Elena McKenna.
And her position in society is to be loved, protected, and raised by people who would die for her. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Everyone waited for Charles to answer, but he had no words left. Finally, Sheriff Patterson spoke. Mr. Whitmore, I think it's time for you to go. And I don't think you should come back. As Charles and his companions rode away, their horses' hooves kicking up dust clouds that the wind quickly scattered, the neighbors began to drift toward home. But before they left, each one stopped to congratulate Thomas and Elena, to admire baby Sarah, and to make it clear that this little family had the protection of the entire community. Doc Morrison was the last to leave. You know, he said to Thomas and Elena as he climbed back onto his horse, I've delivered a lot of babies in my time, and I can always tell which ones are going to grow up happy and loved. That little girl of yours has that look about her. As the dust settled and quiet returned to the ranch, Thomas, Elena, and Sarah sat on their porch watching the sun set over their land. They had faced their greatest threat and emerged stronger than ever. But more than that, they had learned something important about the power of community, the strength that comes from choosing family over blood, and the truth that love is always stronger than money or legal papers or threats from the past. The baby's crying woke Thomas before dawn, but when he rolled over, Elena's side of the bed was empty and cold. He found her in the kitchen, pacing back and forth with little Sarah pressed against her shoulder, both of them silhouetted against the window where the first hint of sunrise painted the sky pink. She won't settle, Elena whispered, her voice tight with worry. Been fussing for hours. What if something's wrong? What if I'm doing everything backwards? Thomas took his daughter gently, feeling her tiny fists beat against his chest as she wailed. The sound cut through him like a knife, but not because it hurt his ears. It was the helpless fear in Elena's eyes that made his heart ache. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's birth, 3 weeks of learning how to be parents together, and still Elena jumped at every little sound the baby made. "Hey there, princess," he murmured, swaying slightly as he'd seen Elena do. "What's got you so upset this morning?" Sarah's cries softened to hiccups, then to the small snuffling sounds babies make when they're deciding whether to keep fussing or give peace a chance. Elena sagged against the kitchen table, exhaustion written in every line of her body. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. Yesterday she seemed so content, and now, what if Charles was right? What if she needs more than I can give her? Thomas felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sharp. Charles Whitmore doesn't know the first thing about being a parent. You think he ever got up in the middle of the night to walk a crying baby? You think he ever worried about whether he was good enough? Elena's laugh was bitter. "No, but he has money, education, a big house in town with servants and a heart made of stone," Thomas finished. He settled into the rocking chair Sarah had used, cradling his daughter against his chest. "You want to know what makes a good parent, Elena? It's not money or fancy houses. It's caring enough to lose sleep. It's worrying about doing right by this little person who depends on you completely." Sarah had gone quiet now, her dark eyes studying Thomas's face with the serious expression babies get when they're learning the world. Elena watched them both, something shifting in her face as she saw how naturally Thomas held their daughter. "Doc Morrison said babies sometimes get fussy when storms are coming," Thomas said, nodding toward the window where clouds were building on the horizon. "Animals sense things we can't. Maybe she's just telling us to batten down the hatches." As if summoned by his words, thunder rumbled in the distance. Elena moved to stand beside the rocking chair, her hand resting on Thomas's shoulder as they both looked down at Sarah, who was finally drifting off to sleep. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still that scared girl who showed up on your doorstep," Elena said quietly. "Like I'm just pretending to be a wife and mother, and any minute someone's going to figure out I don't belong here." Thomas reached up to cover her hand with his free one. "You know what I felt like the day I married my first wife? Like I was playing dress-up in my father's clothes. Like everyone could see I was just a boy trying to act like a man." He smiled, remembering. "Sarah, my first Sarah. She told me something I never forgot. She said feeling like you don't deserve good things just means you understand how precious they are." Elena was quiet for a long moment watching their daughter sleep. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong, or for you to change your mind about us." "What would it take for you to change your mind about me?" Thomas asked. Elena looked startled by the question. "Nothing. There's nothing you could do that would make me stop." She stopped, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Exactly," Thomas said simply. "That's what love means, Elena. It means the choice is made, and you keep making it every day even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." The storm was getting closer now, the thunder coming in shorter intervals. Sarah stirred in Thomas's arms but didn't wake, secure in the knowledge that she was safe and wanted. Elena knelt beside the rocking chair, her hand touching their daughter's tiny fist. "I love her so much it scares me," she admitted. "What if I mess this up? What if I'm not strong enough, or smart enough, or—" "What if you are?" Thomas interrupted gently. "What if you're exactly what she needs? What if all that worry and love you're carrying around is exactly the right amount for raising a daughter who'll know she's cherished?" Lightning flickered outside, followed immediately by thunder that made the windows rattle. Sarah's eyes opened for just a moment, unfocused and peaceful, before drifting closed again. Elena smiled, the first real smile Thomas had seen from her in days. "She's not afraid of the storm," Elena observed. "She knows we're here. That's all any of us can do," Thomas said. "Be there. Show up every day even when we don't feel ready. Even when we're scared we'll do it wrong." The rain started then, gentle at first, then building to a steady drumming on the roof. It was the kind of rain that made houses feel cozy, that made families draw closer together and count their blessings. Elena rose and moved to the stove, starting coffee with the practiced ease she developed over the months of making this place home. "Thomas," she said, not turning around, "thank you for believing I could do this before I believed it myself." He wanted to tell her that she'd done the same for him, that she'd given him back the faith that life could hold more than just survival. But Sarah chose that moment to wake up fully, her small voice joining the chorus of rain and thunder, and Elena was already moving toward them with her arms outstretched, ready to take on whatever came next. Outside, the storm raged, but inside their small cabin, 3 people who'd found each other against all odds settled in to weather it together. 5 years had changed everything and nothing at all. Sarah Elena McKenna toddled through the ranch house on sturdy legs, her dark curls bouncing as she chased the barn cat through rooms that had once echoed with loneliness. At 5 years old, she had Thomas's steady gaze and Elena's stubborn chin, and a laugh that could make even the grumpiest neighbor smile. But today, that laugh was nowhere to be heard. Thomas found his daughter sitting on the front porch steps, her small face serious as she watched the road that led to town. Elena sat beside her, both of them wearing matching expressions of worry that made Thomas's stomach tighten. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling on Sarah's other side. "Mrs. Peterson came by while you were fixing the fence," Elena said carefully. "She had some news from town." Thomas felt the familiar chill that came whenever their peaceful life was threatened. "What kind of news?" "Charles is back," Elena said simply. "He's been asking questions. About us. About Sarah." Sarah looked up at Thomas with eyes too old for her 5-year-old face. "Mama says there's a man who might try to take me away. Is that true, Papa?" The word Papa still made Thomas's heart swell, even after all these years. Sarah had started calling him that when she was barely 2, and it had stuck like honey on warm bread. Now, hearing the worry in her small voice, he felt a rage so fierce it took his breath away. "Nobody's taking you anywhere, princess," he said, pulling her onto his lap. "This is your home. We're your family. That's not going to change." But even as he said the words, Thomas felt the old fear creeping back. Charles Whitmore had money and connections, and the law still favored men like him over families like theirs. 5 years ago, they'd had the element of surprise and a community that rallied around them. Now Whitmore would be prepared. "Why does he want me?" Sarah asked, her voice very small. "I don't even know him." Elena reached over to smooth their daughter's hair. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, sweetheart. Sometimes they think they want something when they really don't understand what they're asking for." It was a gentle way to explain something that wasn't gentle at all. Thomas had heard through various channels over the years that Whitmore had married a woman from back east, someone with family money and social standing. The marriage had produced no children, and now, apparently, he'd decided he wanted the daughter he'd abandoned. "I don't want to go anywhere," Sarah said firmly. "I want to stay here with you and Mama and help with the horses and learn to make bread like Mama does." Thomas exchanged a look with Elena over their daughter's head. They'd always planned to tell Sarah the truth about her birth when she was old enough to understand. They just hadn't expected to have that conversation forced on them by outside circumstances. "Sarah," Elena said gently, "you know how some families look different from other families? How some children live with grandparents or aunts and uncles, or people who choose to love them even if they weren't born to them?" Sarah nodded solemnly. She'd grown up around the diverse families that made up their small community. Children raised by single mothers, by older siblings, by neighbors who stepped in when parents couldn't. "Well, Papa and I chose each other and we chose you," Elena continued. "Before you were born, I made some mistakes, trusted someone I shouldn't have. That someone was Charles Whitmore. He's your biological father, which means you got some of your looks from him, just like you got some from me." Sarah absorbed this information with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "But he left you alone when you needed help?" "Yes," Elena said simply. "And Papa didn't?" "No, Papa didn't," Elena confirmed. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she turned to Thomas with a fierceness that reminded him exactly why he loved this child so completely. Then you're my real papa, she declared. Because real papas don't leave their little girls alone. Thomas felt his throat close with emotion. That's right, princess. Real papas stick around. Elena stood up suddenly, her face set with determination. I need to go to town. If Charles is asking questions, people deserve to hear our side of the story first. Elena, no, Thomas said, rising as well. It's too dangerous. If he sees you, if he sees me, what? I'm not the scared girl who ran away anymore, Thomas. I'm a woman with a family to protect and a community that knows who I really am. Elena's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the fear underneath her courage. I'm coming with you, he said.
No.
Elena shook her head. Someone needs to stay with Sarah. And besides, this is something I need to do myself. I need to stop running from my past and start fighting for my future. Sarah looked back and forth between her parents, understanding more than they probably realized. Are you scared, Mama? Elena knelt down in front of her daughter, taking the small hands in her own. Yes, sweetheart.
I'm scared.
But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared. Like when I was afraid of the dark, but I still went to check on the baby chicks during the storm? Exactly like that, Elena said, smiling despite her worry. Thomas watched his wife and daughter, these two people who had transformed his life in ways he was still discovering. Elena was right. She wasn't the same frightened girl who'd knocked on his door 5 years ago. She'd grown into a woman of strength and purpose, someone who faced challenges head-on instead of running from them. If you're going to town, you're not going alone, he said finally. Sarah can stay with the Morrisons. Doc's wife has been wanting to teach her how to make her famous apple turnovers. Elena started to protest, but Thomas held up his hand. We're a family, Elena. We face things together. That's what families do. As they prepared for what might be the fight of their lives, Thomas realized that everything had indeed changed over the past 5 years. They weren't just 3 people who'd found each other anymore. They were a family with roots deep enough to weather any storm, strong enough to stand against any threat. The question was, would love and determination be enough to protect what they'd built? As they hitched up the wagon for the ride to town, all 3 of them knew they were about to find out.